I think you guys have got to be tired. We're tired. I think we've lost a lot of people, so I'm going to try to get through there's no way we're going to get through all the material from the rest of my slides, but I'm going to pick and choose some slides that I think are relevant, and then we always can talk later on. If I talk about any materials and you want them, if you email me, I will get them to you. And I'm always available if you want to call and talk to me over the phone, etc. I think one of the most alarming, again this morning I said that Larry's way better than statistics than I am, but one of the numbers that I was able to dig up, I think it's important that when speakers come to different states, we kind of learn about some things in your state. Like I wanted to make sure that I knew what your definition of a developmental disability is. So one of these alarming statistics that I found was that this is from a report in 2012 from the Department of Health and Human Services here in Nebraska. And it states, historically, Nebraska has one of the highest rates of state wards per capita in the country. In 2010, Nebraska's rate of children in out-of-home care was 10.9 per 1,000 children, while the national rate was only around 5%. So it's pretty high. So the Department of Human and Health Services talks about how they need to increase the number of available services to prevent at-risk children and juveniles from becoming state wards. And I would be curious just how many of those kids that are in the study or in their statistics actually have an FASD diagnosis. It would be a good thing to try to work on, figure out, because I bet it's pretty high. What do you think? How high is it? Mm-hmm.
I think it's pretty high, but I think it's probably
more that are undiagnosed? Okay, I agree.
But there's probably a lot that should be diagnosed.
Right, I also agree. What I want to talk about a couple minutes before I go into some red flags to look for these kids. And then I'm going to spend a couple minutes on some legal issues. And then I'm going to finish up telling two stories of two of my clients, Lisa and AJ. In 2012, and if you haven't read this, I think we provided you guys with a copy of the detailed report. In 2012, the American Bar Association finally spoke up on this issue. And I worked with Howard Davidson from the Center on Children and the Law, and it was our idea that we needed to get the ABA, the American Bar Association, behind this resolution. And when it passed, we ended up having about 13 different entities that supported it with the ABA, including the Judges Society, the Judicial Division of the American Bar Association. And one of the things that we urged in the report, and I'm going to just read a section that is relevant to what I was talking about this morning. The ABA urged, I'm reading this, state law and policy may often not list FASD-related impairments within their state definition of what constitutes a developmental disability. It's important that FASD, alcohol-related neurological disorders, alcohol-related birth defects, and prenatal alcohol exposure needs to be included in the statutory definition of what constitutes a developmental disability so that these kids get the provided medical treatment that they need. So this is just something else you can cite when you're filing your motion or something when you're doing public policy work here to urge the Nebraska Disability Law Center to start advocating for these kids. The other thing I want to talk about just for a couple minutes, the Office of the Juvenile Justice through the Department of Justice, based on this resolution, has put together a committee. Now, I've got a couple things that I'm going to talk about. The report has not been released yet, but I got some of these from Howard Davidson from the ABA. And what Howard and I did was we compared the American Bar Association resolution on FASD and looked at what the Department of Justice is going to recommend. As soon as the report comes out, I'll make sure everyone has a copy of it. We thought it was going to be out before April, but it's not. One of the big things that we looked at with the ABA policy is that children with FASD are at a much higher risk of getting in trouble with the law than kids that are not. Confirming an FASD diagnosis is critical for both treatment, sentencing, and fashioning alternative to incarceration so the judge has other avenues or venues for treatment for the child. The answer is not putting them in juvenile hall because they're not going to have the treatment there that they need. The ABA policy also went on to talk about children with FASD need SSI, and they need advocacy done by disability organizations, including Protection and Advocacy, and local organizations, including the ARC. Anybody here from the ARC? I'm not surprised. And I think one of the things that I think would also be a good recommendation is some states have looked at child advocacy clinics at the law school, and they focus on advocacy for kids with disabilities, mental illness, and also FASD. And that's another avenue you can also try. I'm just going to mention a couple things that the Department of Justice is looking at, which I think are really relevant. And this is the Department of Justice saying FASD should be a mitigating factor in considering transfers of cases from juvenile to adult court. And I think that is so important. A formal diagnosis, if not possible, we have to find a way to at least obtain the maternal alcohol use to see if the child's been exposed to alcohol. We must then put together a multiple disciplinary FASD team that includes school teachers, special education teachers, social workers, neuropsychologists, and medical doctors to look at the best approach for helping these kids who are going to have problems later in life, as Larry talked about, going to adulthood. I'm not going to go over any more of this, but I think it's important, and I'm very happy that the Department of Justice is doing this. And one of the things I'll say for prosecutors that are here is there's a double-volume journal that Larry and I worked on, and we specifically had someone from the Department of Justice do an article on victimization, because that's an area that we often forget about. And if prosecutors are not trained, they'll often say, well, this victim of a crime is not going to be credible. She has memory problems. She has FASD. Well, if the prosecutor is trained to then understand how to be sensitive, and in a case recently in LA, the prosecutor called me on the phone. I was shocked and said, we have an FASD victim. Do you have any articles that you could send me? Sure. So we did. And one of the articles that we sent We got a guy from the Department of Justice. We got some other experts, including Nora Baladarian, one of the leading experts in the country on victimization, suggestibility in working with victims with disabilities. And they wrote an article that's really amazing. I learned something by reading that article. So if the prosecutors then are trained to understand the issues with the victim, maybe they'll be more sensitive to our clients then too when they come through the court. And if you email me, I will make sure you get, it's about 12 articles, including one from Judge Jeffries in Alaska. Larry did 2 articles. I think my article is in your packet, but all the leading experts in the country wrote articles, and there's got to be at least 6 on juvenile justice that are worth reading. Let's talk a little bit about some red flags real quick. These are things that come out of all the literature. A lot of this stuff Larry's talked about already, but a lot of this stuff Ken Jones found back in the original studies that were done in 1973. But I think at the top of the list is the most important, because I've had a lot of clients when I've gotten the birth records or later on got the records and it looks like he's had or she's had heart problems. And I didn't recognize that at first, and it's a really big issue in these cases. So when you're getting the medical records, look for any kind of heart problems, even at age 6. If you have that, chances are you're on the right track. The second one, failure to thrive, I've put only in FAS cases, but I've seen it in FASD cases too. These kids are going to have feeding difficulties, and if you see a doctor ever write failure to thrive, and I've seen it in 2 cases, then you're on the right track again. Another red flag that you may have an FASD client. Sleeping difficulties, Larry covered that, but on the case we're going to talk about with Lisa, she had a lot of problems sleeping. And even at age 8 or 9, or I think as late as age 10, she was still drinking from a baby bottle. And that's the only thing that would put this client to sleep. These kids are overstimulated. They're very irritable. Jitterness and seizures is normally another red flag. I've had, I would say, 20-25% of all my cases, they've had seizure disorders, these kids. So if you see that, that's another area to look at. In one of my cases, this came up, and the aunt who we interviewed said, Johnny always had problems with his ears, and he would put his finger in there and always do that. I could never figure it out. Well, the client had problems communicating, and he had an earache. He had an infection. And he could never tell his aunt that his ear hurt. So he would go back to the doctors, get medication, and come back. And the more research we did, we found out that these kids are prone to infections in their ears. So if you see that, it's another red flag to look for. I had a case, I want to talk a little bit about just the word irritable. And I had a client with FASD in juvenile court, and she didn't like the word irritable if I used it. She knew what it meant. And she said, no, I'm crabby. I'm cranky. I'm not irritable. And I said, well, okay. So this client, I would always entice, which I do for most of my clients, and I like to use the term open the lines of communication. And I encourage all of my clients, juvenile or adults, to write to family members. And in this case, we were trying to connect her with her grandmother. She'd been taken out of the home. Her mother was a prostitute. But she lived with grandma for a while. But she had a lot of behavior problems, and no one knew it was FASD. And I was trying to reconnect her with her grandmother because she loved her so much, and that's all she talked about was Grammy. Grammy. So I encouraged the client to write to Grammy. And I gave her about 10 cards and some envelopes, and I checked with Grammy to make sure it was okay. And Grammy said, sure. I said, well, but are you going to write back? Yes, I will. Promise? Because I don't want you to write to her and then you not respond. You're going to break her heart. I'll write, I promise. So we go to court that day, and she's having problems sitting still. She's jittery. And the judge looks at me and says, Mr. Edwards, why can't your client sit still? And I looked at the judge, and I said, Judge, I think she's very irritable today. And the client said, no, I'm crabby, Judge. So then I said to her, we're going to put your case over. We're going to continue it. And I said, the bad news is the prosecutor wants to send you to the California Youth Authority. Oh, well, what does that mean? They're going to try to send your case to to adult court. That prosecutor sitting right there wants to put you in California Youth Authority. So she looks at me and she said, do you think we should send her a card? I said, no. So she looks at me and she looks at the judge. Should I send him one? I said, no. I said, look, and I'm trying to not talk so loud. I said, look, the prosecutor is not a mean person. She just wants to put you in the California Youth Authority because that's her job. But why? I said, that's her job, and we'll leave it at that today. But I want you to continue writing to Grammy. So that day, I go down to see her at the juvenile hall. Grammy sent her 2 cards and a gift certificate. And the gift certificates you can use in juvenile hall in California to buy Fritos and junk like that. So it worked out because ultimately Granny was a great witness. And after we got the FASD diagnosis, the judge made the right ruling and kept her in juvenile court. And we didn't get to adult court. But I think we just have to be creative, too, with these cases. And I think another take-home message, too, that I think Larry may have mentioned, but I'm going to put a twist on it, and that is these cases are a lot of work. This is not like just getting a psychologist to do an IQ test and adaptive, and yes, I have the school records and I'm done. These cases involve a lot of records, a lot of interviews, a lot of maternal history, interviewing mom multiple times if she exists, and then getting the right diagnosis. Because if we get the right diagnoses and not 27 other that the doctors who are not trained that give these kids anti-personality disorder and conduct disorder, which is wrong because they don't understand FASD, like Larry said, that's the problem that we have to keep in mind. I think on this slide, a quick important thing is just a lot of these kids are going to have orthopedic problems, poor balance. Look for all that. That's another reason why if you have an important case, you may need a neurologist looking at those things. Hyperactivity. They're at high risk for abuse and neglect and out-of-home placement, which we've already talked about. I'm going to blow through this real quick, but Larry mentioned this. They're going to have learning problems. They're going to have poor math skills. And I think a lot of this stuff is going to tie into the actual adjudication of the case. Memory problems, looking at the IQ. they're going to be immature. They're going to have major impulse control problems. They're going to have poor judgment. They're going to have problems with lying and stealing and a lot of oppositional behavior. A lot of these cases, we also see a lot of truancy, a lot of dropout, and a lot of expulsion. And the issue, again, there, it's because the schools are focusing too much on the behavior and not the impairments. And the school teachers are missing the signs, or they don't know that maybe the kid has FASD, or he hasn't been diagnosed yet. Why is the kid not going to school? Because he can't sit still. He's trying, but he can't learn the materials. So it's all about getting the right environment set up for this child in school as well. We're going to skip this. We're going to skip this. We're going to move on to, let's backtrack. I want to show you guys this. We're going to really quickly go through experts. We're not going to have a lot of time, but I want to show you an MRI of a case that I worked on of a child that we used in getting services and also convincing a judge not to waive them up to adult court. I think a multiple disciplinary team is important. Not for every case, but for a lot of cases, you need a good social worker, a good neuropsychologist, a neurologist, a pediatric doctor, especially if it's a child. And one of the things I recently learned, I had a case, the child was 14, and there's actually pediatric neuropsychologists out there. I mean, there's tests that are designed just for kids that you don't give to adults. So I think if you have a case, there are, and there's a lot of, I had a case and we tried to use Dr. David Stretland from Johns Hopkins. He wouldn't take the case because the kid was 16. He only saw people over the age of 18 because there are certain tests that you give kids, etc. So I think if you can't find a doctor here, consult with someone who is able to consult locally. In a lot of the cases that I've worked on, if we can't get the experts from Seattle, we'll get the local neuropsychologist and we'll have him consult with Paul Connor up in Seattle. And again, if you have doctors and psychologists and neuropsychs that you think you want to get trained, if you reach out to me, I will put them in contact with the right people. And they can go and get the training that they need. It will not cost them anything other than a flight. And that's it. And I might, depending on how many people go, I even probably can arrange free housing because I've got enough people up there that would put them up. And we've already had about 6 or 7 people from different states go up there and get training. So if you guys know people, I'll make the connections for you to get it started. Let's talk about an MRI here real quick. There's work, we're going to skip this. There's a lot of work being done up at the University of Washington in Seattle by a guy named Fred Bookstein. Now, there's also other people, and there's also Claire Coles from Emory University. But what Fred does is Fred looks at just the corpus callosum. We talked about what that is. Anybody remember what part of the brain that is? Right in the middle. So, a lot of the other people that do this are more research-based. He's research-based, but he's also forensically based. And he testifies in a lot of cases, including death penalty cases. But in this case that we had, we were trying to get services for George, and we were also trying to keep him out of the adult court. So what Fred does, all right, so this is George. And then what he does is he compares it to an average unexposed male, which means this person who they used the study from did not have any alcohol exposure on the corpus callosum. So the dotted line would be the normal one. This is my client. This is George. Look at the size of the indentation in his corpus callosum. It was severely damaged. So we used that to convince the judge and the disability organization in California that he was born with this brain damage because mom drank and that he needed services. And the judge needs to look at this in terms of mitigating evidence to not send this kid to the adult court. Now, here's some other, this would be considered a normal corpus callosum right here. This is a little damaged. You're damaged here. Look at that. It's totally missing, and that's gone. So often these kids are not born with any corpus callosum. Sometimes it's missing, sometimes it's damaged. But this is really important work, and if you want to know about the articles, I can send you a boatload of stuff that they've done. This is some work that's done by Sarah Matson and Ed Riley. Ed Riley's down at San Diego State. But you don't use it on every case. You use it on a specific case that you know you need the leverage on. And in this case, we needed the leverage, even though we had extensive neuropsych testing. We had a neurologist, and we had a medical doctor that diagnosed the kid with FASD. Okay, so we're going to skip. All right, we're going to go over some legal issues here. All right, one of the areas that I think FASD applies to, and that the first one is competency to stand trial. And I think that any child who's in juvenile court, I think an attorney has to look at competency for any kid, especially depending on the age. But for sure, if the child has a learning disability or FASD, and you cannot just look at the IQ level. You can't. I think a lot of psychologists and a lot of lawyers will say, okay, her IQ level's 98, got to be competent. Definitely. I'm not even going to go down that road. Bad mistake. Because you may have a client with a high IQ and very low adaptive. You may have a client with severe executive functioning cognitive deficits, but yet a very high IQ. Poor memory recall. So how's that client going to be able to help you if the memory is that damaged or they can't remember certain things? These kids often have difficulty with abstract language. They don't understand figures of speech, jokes, sarcasm, or teasing. They're unable to often follow directions, inability to see the need to follow rules, and they may not think rationally about their options. The real issue is, does your client understand what's going on in the courtroom procedures? If you have a competency case, we're not going to go much into detail on this, but I really suggest you look at the work by Thomas Grisso, Randy Otto out of Florida. There's a lot of tests that you can use, including the competency assessment to stand trial for mental retardation. There's a lot of tests out there that you could use for kids with FASD. I also think FASD plays a huge role in search and seizure issues, specifically false confessions. And I'll go a little bit into some of the things that I think are relevant to do with these cases. Larry talked about this, and I can't emphasize it more importantly. When you have a false confession, you have to look at not only the IQ level, but you have to look at the reading and writing and comprehension level of these kids. If you're only looking at a 4th or 5th grade, and the Miranda warnings are fairly straightforward. I mean, how many cases have we had? I'm sure you get them in Nebraska, where the cop loves to turn the recorder off. It just happened that it got turned off while we were giving the client the Miranda warnings, but we turned it on just when they were talking. But for some reason, we couldn't figure out that the recorder was broken. So you got to attack these confessions, and I'm going to give you some ideas of what to do. Where the statements recorded or written by your client. I had a case recently where the police officer said, we're going to talk to you about the case, but we want you to write down what happened. And the kid decided to do it. But the police kind of put some words in his mouth. And they were really long words that I didn't think he understood what they were. Because when I asked him later, he didn't understand. And I knew when I went back to see the client after we had the testing done, I asked him, do you know what the word Constitution means? And he said, yeah. He says, he was excited. I'm going to get this one right. I know what it means. I said, what does it mean? It's like my dad. He's a construction worker. I know that word. I said, wow, you got it right. So the testing from the psychologist revealed a 3rd grade reading level, 2nd grade writing level. On that case, we decided to use an expert, and we brought in an expert in the area of juveniles and confessions. Yeah, one of these cases, I would highly recommend you looking at the work from Stephen Drizzen, Northwestern University, one of the leading professors in the country on this issue. So we had testimony from experts, and then the other testimony that's free that we can use is we call the school teachers, and I think they're great witnesses for a suppression hearing or even a competency hearing, because they're going to come in, they're going to talk about the client's need for a one-on-one tutor, 2-on-1 maybe, reads on a 2nd grade level. And then in the case I recently did a competency hearing on, we got the teacher to send the homework and the schoolwork from the child. And it was kindergarten level stuff. And this is a 16-year-old kid, special ed. And I think the most propelling testimony was the special education teacher who went into, here's a kid who's reading on a 2nd grade level, and he's 16 years old. So interview and have your experts interview the school teachers when you have your hearing for suppression or for competency. In that case, the judge made the right call, suppressed the statements. I also think it's important that we subpoena the police officers' training materials. I think if you have a police officer who testifies in court, you ask them questions. Have you been trained in the area of juvenile justice? Yeah, they all have. Right. Okay. Then you make the questions a little harder. Have you been trained in the area of learning disabilities? Yes, sir, I have. Give me an example. Well, I know what ADHD is. Okay, you got it. And you go further. Officer, have you been trained in the area of fetal alcohol spectrum disorders? Chances are he probably hasn't. So subpoena the training materials to see what training they've gotten when you ask the questions. And I think this is important too for the prosecutor when you have a victim with FASD and you want to see how the officers handled her interview. If she's a victim of a crime, maybe they're not sensitive enough to know how to deal with this lady who's been abused because of the FASD. So I think it's an important thing for both sides. One of the things that I also love to do, I love field trips. So I love to go out to police stations and I get a court order from the judge and I want to see the room where this kid was interrogated in. Or when the kid was sent to the principal's office and the room's very small and the police are outside the door. I want to see the room because when I question the officers, I want to be able to talk about the size of that room as it relates to the confession. So I'll often go out, I'll videotape the room of where the client was interrogated. I think issues of voluntariness are very important. These kids love to please authoritative figures. They're going to say pretty much anything that the cops want them to say. And they often just take blame too quickly. And what they like to do is they like to paint a picture of themselves, I think, of just being a really bad kid rather than being stupid. And they do this because they want to be accepted. They often join gangs because no one loves them. and they end up usually with the wrong crowds. Skip over that. We'll talk a couple minutes here about sentencing. I think all kids with FASD are less culpable. They're not going to understand the consequences of their behavior. Their actions are often a result of impulse control problems. Juveniles are extremely vulnerable to peer pressure, and they often are great candidates for gang-related crimes. I had one case recently where a 16-year-old kid who we had diagnosed with FASD was charged with driving a truck from Mexico, Tijuana, up to LA, and they didn't tell the kid that had dope in the truck. He thought he was going to get some lollies. So he drove the truck up to LA, gets arrested, and he tells the cops, hey, I did the job that nobody else wanted to do. Nobody wanted to go to Tijuana for a couple of lollipops, but I did. Unfortunately, I'm going to lose the client because the feds are going to pick it up. So it's going to now become a federal prosecution. I think these kids are also scapegoats, too. And that's an issue that we have to deal with when we're looking at these kids. FASD is going to be an important factor in looking at what role the client played in the offense of the crime. And I think we need to look at that when we're evaluating the case. This is something I think that it's important for judges to look at, and that sanctions may be initiatives. You got to look at the structure and the security of the environment the child's in, and do not expect that these kids are going to learn from their sanctions when you give them sanctions in court. Same thing Larry was talking about. They're not going to learn from their mistakes. They're not going to understand cause and effect when they do things. We're going to talk a little bit about success. I think removal, this is what Larry was really trying to hammer home, removal of supportive services where these kids will always invite failure for them. We have to look at treatment plans and supportive services for every different developmental period. So a child who's 8, a child who's 14, a child who's 12 is going to have different needs. And we have to make sure that we address these through each developmental period. We have to look at treatment in terms of providing the child with appropriate accommodations, not only in the home environment, but school as well. And I think the most important thing is we have to find talents with each child who has FASD and build on those for success. And I'm going to talk about 2 cases which I think will kind of help to wrap the day up. This is my client, Lisa. We talked a little bit about her this morning. She had a brother and a sister who were also in the Competency court who got diagnosed, but she did not. She was born premature to a mother abusing both alcohol and drugs. At age 4, she's removed from the home. And the records that we later discovered showed that she was inside of an animal cage without diapers or clothes. She had various orphanage placements, 7 foster care placements, and 15 psychiatric hospitalizations since the age of 4. At age 4, a lot of the records talked about the things that we've been talking about all day: sleeping disorder that she had, jitterness, fidgeting, and aggression. At age 6, she has her first attempt at committing suicide by putting her hand through a window. All the school records that we got on her just would show that she was placed in a severely emotionally disturbed classes. But again, the breakdown of the system was that eventually when she gets to 1st grade, her sister is in that same school, and the brother is in the grade behind in the same school, but yet no one put the puzzle together and figured out two of them have FASD, but Lisa's never been diagnosed. So at age 7, the records were showing that Lisa was regressing to a baby under any amount of pressure. At age 10, she would cool up like a baby with a baby bottle and have baby talk. And this was one of the, I think, most scariest cases that I ever had in my career, because I've never had a client with these behavior disorders. And this is one of the first things I noticed when I went to see her in the state hospital. The records would show that she would use airplane glue, hairspray, and whiteout to get high. But when she had problems with anxiety, she would get down on all of her fours and start acting like a dog. So I had been out to the state hospital for like 10 years, and they don't really search lawyers that bad. I mean, I've taken whiteout when I've gone out for stuff I made an error writing. But when I went out to see Lisa, the hospital called me and they said, "Mr. Edwards, you cannot bring any whiteout." And I'm like, "Why?" I figured it's a new policy. Nope. Your client likes to sniff airplane glue and whiteout, so you cannot bring it in the hospital. She may try to use it. Okay. So one of the things that I noticed when I got to the hospital was in the records, in the social history, right on top, it said the brother had been diagnosed with FASD. So that was my first red flag for Lisa. We also learned something about her, is that she often would have to be put in 5-point restraints because she would often get angry. And this is one of the reports that I was able to get. It talked about her scratching herself, biting herself, banging her head, and pulling her hair out. And she did this often for attention. But when I went to see her for the first time, when they brought her into the room, she jumps down on the ground like a dog and starts walking up to me. And that was my first introduction to Lisa. At age 17, she attempted to strangle herself with a vacuum cleaner hose. She threatened to kill staff at the group home. And we could never figure out until we did the research on why she just hated security guards. And then we realized later on that her father was a security guard that abused her. This was her first crack at the juvenile court. And the sad thing was that she had a public defender. Again, the public defender never bothered getting any of the dependency court records or social service records, because if they would have found out some of the early history on her. So this public defender says, "Well, Lisa, I got you an offer to stay in juvenile hall. You won't get sent to the California Youth Authority. However, you're going to plead out to a strike because you try to light a fire at a group home." So here's Lisa at 17. She now has 1 strike on her record. At age 18, she tries to start doing things like swallowing safety pins and screws, and they admit her again to a psychiatric hospital. This is where a lot of Lisa's problems started around 22. She's kicked out of a group home. She's living on the streets. She goes back to that group home, threatens to burn down the group home. Again, she's appointed a public defender. I was able to get access to the file in that case. The file was about that thin. After 3.5 years of representing her, and this was before we even started litigating for services, we had 3.5 banker boxes of records on this girl. So that lawyer had no one appointed, no psychologist, did talk, which was unusual, to the foster sister, who we later interviewed. The foster sister did not know that her brother and sister had been diagnosed with FASD, so her foster sister just said, "You know what, Lisa's got a lot of behavior problems, she just can't get it together," and that was it. And the judge said, Bye. Off for 3 years she went to the state prison. However, here was her problem. This was now 2 strikes for Lisa. So she sits in prison for a while. And while in prison, she attempts her most serious suicide attempt and cuts her wrist. She's later put in a cast. They take her back to the prison, and the records from the witnesses, the prison guards see that she's bleeding so bad, she tries to pull her cast off. So the prison guard then decided to have her evaluated by a psychiatrist. That psychiatrist sees her and says, guess what? Based on the fact that you tried to light 2 fires, based on all the behavior problems in your charts, again, as Larry was stressing, they're not focusing on her impairments, only her behavior. We're going to label you a mentally disordered offender, and in California, that means we can lock you up for life in a state hospital. So I got the case when she was 27, and she goes 27 years of her life without ever being diagnosed. God, how did that judge ever miss this stuff when she was 4 years old? Social services missed it. The schools missed it. How did both public defenders miss it? I have no idea. But they did. But we ultimately got her diagnosed. And then we started advocating for services. So my first crack, and this is a case that we used Paul Connor on from Seattle. We had all the best experts that we could get. We even had Dr. Ken Jones from San Diego come up and assess her. And then the biggest piece of the puzzle was the adaptive. And we had Dr. Stephen Greenspan come out from Colorado to do that. So we were ready. And when we applied to the disability organization in LA, they said, you'll never get this client services in California. She has an IQ of 98. What are you, crazy? And I said, I don't know. So at that point, I said, great. I'm not going to give up hope on Lisa. The system's failed her, but I'm not going to. So I reached out to Disability Rights California, and I said, hey, I got a hot case for you, man. This is going to be a cutting edge. This could be the first case in California. Are you interested? Maybe. So after numerous meetings, they said yes. Now in California, and our little neuropsychologist, young lady over here actually worked in California, so she's familiar with this. This is called we have the 5th category out there. And what that is someone that needs services similar to a person with an intellectual disability, or someone that needs treatment similar to a person with an intellectual disability. And that's the language that we used to hang our hat on. But what we did was Disability Rights Organization said, hey, we're not going to file an appeal against the Los Angeles Disability Organization because they're way too conservative. Let's get Loki or Lisa placed in Orange County, where her brother's getting services already. And the judge said to me, well, Billy, if you can get her placed with her foster sister. And we had a hearing, and we had all the doctors testify that she has FASD. And again, what Larry was talking about, these experts hammered home to this judge, this is not behavior. This is impairment that this woman has to have, that you have to look at. And the judge said, well, if you don't have a DSM diagnosis, prosecutor, and we have FASD, I'm letting her out. The judge made the call, and I think he made the right call. And we got her out. And we got her placed with her foster sister. This was the first time in 28 plus years, and I still say child, this person, I call her a child, this person was living in the community. We were all scared. I think the judge was. But the decision that we made was, let's apply for services down in Orange County. And I said to the disability lawyer, Orange County? You mean like where Disneyland is? Like Mickey Mouse? Like, it's super conservative down there. Yeah, it is, but her brother's in there. So we applied. Their doctors did not even evaluate Lisa. And they said, your client is going to be one of our consumers. And we got her in. And she is now receiving music therapy, working with sea life mammals that are found in Laguna Beach in a marina. And one of the things that I wanted to do, and just like Larry talked about, Lisa loved to talk. And she says, Billy, I really want to talk to the judge. You know, he already let me out. What can I do? I want to talk to the judge. And I said, all right. Well, what do you want to say? Because we went back for a progress report. And she said, look, I just want to say some things. And she writes this, and I'm reading what she wrote to the judge. Judge, music has always been a very important part of who I am. It gives me a place to go when I need to settle myself. I spend time with Miranda. She's my music therapist. I want to play the guitar and the piano. This is my message to you, Judge. I wish I could go back in time to when my mother was going to take that first sip of alcohol. I would push the freeze frame button and replace the glass of alcohol with my message. Please think before you drink. Life with FASD is very difficult, scary, and forever. My brain, Judge, is never going to get better. Billy says I could get worse. God, I hope not. So please, tell people that come to you, think before you drink. And that was her message. And I tell you, I had a hard time not crying when she read that to that judge. So I think that you guys have everything that Larry said to go out and make a difference in this area. And I know that you can do it. And I hope that Nebraska becomes one of the leading states for advocacy on FASD. So thanks for coming. And like Larry said, if just one of you guys in this room gets a client diagnosed in the next couple months, we've done our work here today. If this judge goes back and tells other judges, let's get some training on this. This is important stuff.